if I only had 6 months to live, would I take the job? And the answer was no.
You listen to the podcast and you read all these articles and everybody gives you these tools that are set out and they tell you, okay, start here, do this, build yourself a network, rebrand yourself. And then you're like, okay, I can't do all that because I have a full-time job. I have kids to raise. I then have to find me time to look after myself.
The biggest difference for me has been to introduce space. Behind you stands invisibly 1,000 other women with the same question.
Emotions are actually really important as part of the workplace. There are too many managers and leaders that believe there's no place for it. The thing I found trying to support women is confidence is the number one challenge, and not recognizing actually the talent and the experience they have.
Your biggest learnings in making that transition, what would that be? Welcome to Raw with Uma, and I'm Uma, your host and architect of Raw Leadership. Here to bring you unfiltered, unrehearsed, and unscripted conversations with women about what really goes on in navigating life and work. Are you ready? Let's get raw. I'm here today with my guest, Mona. I only know your first name, and we've just met.
Yes, we have.
And we have never spoken before.
Never.
I have no idea what you're going to ask me today.
Well, I've got lots of questions, but yes.
So let's start with you first. Tell me a little bit about where you grew up, how long you've been in Singapore, what you do,
Okay.
and why did you decide to come on the show?
All right. Well, to start with, my name's Mohana, not Mona. So
Okay.
everyone calls me Mona because it was a tough time getting them to pronounce my name in school. So
I can say Mohana.
Yes, so please call me that.
Okay, Mohana.
So it's Mohana and my surname is Raju. I'm Malaysian. I grew up across the causeway.
A fellow Malaysian. Nice.
Yes, and I used to travel to school every day, and I went to school in Singapore. So I spent a good number of years doing that. And then I went on to school in university in Australia at Monash. And then, of course, like everyone else who decided, well, I should just stay overseas and not come home. Being the oldest child, I was like, no, I have responsibilities. So I'll just head home. And, well, Singapore has become second home for me since then. I get older. And given that I went through a very life-changing or life-altering event last year with medical and stuff, I thought, oh dear, can I keep doing this going forward? I have a very client-facing role, which requires me, of course, to speak a lot. And then I thought, oh, what happens if I can't do much of that? What do I do next? And I was just thinking to myself, what should I do? And that's what caught me about career transition. What am I going to do next? How am I going to move on to do whatever I do have to do next? And transition to me is always a process. You have to start somewhere, you have to plan it, and then you have to go through. Because for me, everything has to be in a structured manner. So I'm like, okay, let's do this, but where do I start? And yes, you listen to the podcast and you read all these articles and everybody gives you these tools that are set out and they tell you, okay, start here, do this, build yourself a network, rebrand yourself. And then you're like, okay, I can't do all that because I have a full-time job. I have kids to raise. I have family to look after. I then have to find me time to look after myself. So what do I do? And that's when I came across Lean In. I mean, I've always heard about you guys, but I've never had the time to go out there, do something for myself. I've always been doing so much for others that I thought, well, now this year onwards, I'm going to do something for myself. So that's why I came across your network and I've been reading everything that you've been posting. And I thought when I had the opportunity to say, okay, let's get on the show, I was like, I'll write in. I'll say this is what I want to talk about and let's see if they find that interesting. So here I am.
Well, I'm glad you're here, Mohana. And it's nice to meet someone from across the causeway. And for those who are listening in from anywhere in the world, across the causeway in Singapore is this little town called Johor Bahru in Malaysia, where I grew up. Let's start with your question.
All right. So I was wondering, I mean, having been in the corporate life all these years, what do you do? I mean, do you just tell yourself if I have to transition, the very first thing I should do is start looking for things outside of the corporate life? I mean, should I look for something within the corporate sector where I currently work in that organization that perhaps will have something interesting for me to do outside of what I'm still doing? Or should I just take the plunge and say, okay, I'm done. I should start doing something completely outside? Because that's probably the biggest and probably the most hardest step for me at the moment. Like, should I just venture out completely, or should I do something and start looking for something within?
So maybe my first question then is, what got you to this point for you to ask yourself this question?
So I guess it was, as I told you, I have a very client-facing role, and I do speak to a lot of clients on a very regular basis, and that takes me around the world to meet different people in different cultures, and that's been life-altering. I must tell you, meeting all these people, learning about their culture, environment, has been very helpful to the person I am today. It has taught me a lot of resilience, tolerance, and all that. So because of that exposure, I've always thought this is a fantastic environment for me to grow in. But from the time I got pretty ill last year, I thought, am I really going to be able to do what I do best and still be able to do what I do for the company? Or should I take a bit of maybe it's not the right positive word, but a bit of a backseat and let someone else do this, because maybe this is just not completely for me. So that was why the question came up.
Okay. So I guess we all have, I have what I call the sticky floor, what we do to hold ourselves back. So if you had a chance to think about that, and I don't know if you did, do you think that's part of it? Like, are you getting feedback that you are not showing up the way that you did before? Or is it more what you are telling yourself?
Yeah, I think it's more what I tell myself. I think I probably set myself very high standards. I do that because I feel I don't want to really hear it from someone. So I do set it upon myself to give myself those high standards. I have never heard from my colleagues or even friends about how I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. That's not true. And I think some of them are extremely kind to that point where they're not even telling me, hey, Mona, you sound a little different. Or, no, they've been very kind about all of this.
Yeah.
But I think I've just put a lot of pressure on myself saying, no, this is not it. And then when you come to this very nice number in your life, which is the half a century mark, you're like, okay, so maybe this is not altogether coming right. So what should I do? Because transitioning is a process, right? It'll take some time. And even if I start now, it might happen in the next 4, 5, 6 years. It could be sooner, it could be later. So there's always a thought, I guess, and it's just been playing on my mind a little more.
Yeah.
Probably because of what I've gone through last year compared to maybe it might have come later if this had never happened.
Yeah. Okay. So sounds like this recent health incident has caused you to pause to think about life.
Yes.
And for me, actually, I think about the fact that I'm going to live much longer than my parents. I mean, both my parents died in their 70s.
Right.
And I know I'm going to outlive them. So that's this whole, maybe 50 years ahead of me, I hope, that I'm going to live well. And so some of the questions that has worked for me, at least, is starting with first, what are my non-negotiables in life now? And I think, as women, when we have a lot of energy and time given to the people around us, we put ourselves last. And when that starts to taper down, suddenly you go like, oh, hang on a minute, what about me? The biggest difference for me has been to introduce space and to have space in my life to think about things clearly. Is going back to spirituality. And my number one thing is meditation and the exercise of gratitude. But it's also walking alone in the morning, the things that I'm doing on my own. I recently just came back from a trip, so I had a lot of time in the car because it was a very big country, and that just opens up my mind to think about things. What I have learned is that, to what you say is true, it takes a long time to think about the same thing. And then slowly, for me, I believe in putting it out in the universe. And then somehow it comes back to you in little bits and pieces, and then you're going to have to connect the dots. So a lot of patience, I would say, is required. And then I have a set of like big questions that I ask myself.
Right.
So, like when this very amazing job came up, I asked myself, well, if I only had 6 months to live, would I take the job? And the answer was no. So for that reason, I said no to going for the interview and then keeping on the path of what I'm trying to build right now.
Right.
I asked myself, well, what is it that feels like play to me but work to others? To try and figure out where are my gifts that I can do so easily that I don't have to overthink it. It doesn't take much energy.
And I realized that having a good support system was very important, because all this time I feel I've been the one to support everyone to do whatever they've needed to do. And so now if I turn around and look around and I'm like, okay, so who should I, lean on, as I call it, to do this while I'm doing what I'm doing? And taking those first baby steps forward. And then as they get bigger, you know a bit more about where you're headed.
What I have learned is to introduce messiness into my life and imperfections.
Okay.
And as someone who is very judgmental, critical, has a lot of pressure she puts on herself, a big planner needs to know A to Z, plus plan B, C, D. I have learned that letting go is one of the biggest things that was sucking my energy, which now has freed up energy for me to actually give to get clarity. And you have to, in my experience, introduce that slowly. And I love what you say about a tribe. And I think home is where your tribe is, and your tribe can be anywhere. So I have big friendships that I invest in, and it's okay if I don't talk to them for months, especially if they don't live in the same country. But I am intentionally making the time to speak to them, to send messages, voice memos on WhatsApp, pictures, etc., that we are connected. And I think that connection has been for me one of the most important things in my life for the people that I love and care about. So rethinking who my tribe is. And I like to think of the people who want what's best for you will do what's best for you. And they have your best interests at heart. And I just see everyone else as noise.
And I remember that there was one post you put about a party that you couldn't go to even though your friend was leaving. And I thought, wow,
Yeah.
I should have probably done the same. And, I was like, but how do I find the courage to do these things, right? So
one question that I find is super helpful for me now in whether or not I want to commit to doing something is a recency question test. So let's say someone's saying, oh, will you come and speak to this event next month? And I ask myself, if that event was happening this evening, would I say yes? And if the answer is no, I'm going to say no.
okay.
Because it's so easy to see an empty calendar weeks from now and say yes to it.
Yes.
But I have found that for me, at this point in time, if it was happening this evening, if I'm not saying yes to it, I shouldn't be saying yes to it a few weeks from now.
It's easy when someone else is doing it and you're looking at them and you're going, wow, you can do this. And then you tell yourself, but you can do this too. And then you look at your list of to-dos and you're like, no, not today. I'll do it tomorrow. And then the tomorrow becomes next week. And things just get pushed out. How did this plan come into your mind with this all the corporate work that you were doing? I mean, like, where did this little idea fizz in your brain and you go, okay, this is how I'm going to start doing this?
I think my number one job is to figure out the highest and truest expression of myself.
Right.
And to align that to what the universe might have plans for me. And the universe has dreamt a bigger dream for me. And this show is a part of that. Is, to scale all these conversations. Because I can tell you behind you stands invisibly 1,000 other women with the same question. And so that's why I wanted to go ask myself this question. And it's hard and I've invested in therapy. I've done the Hoffman process. I still have so much more work to do on myself, but it's a process.
Right. Have you come across people who've been able to just transition within what they do currently in an environment that they work with because there's something else that the organization or companies kind of look to, with an aging population, especially these days? I mean, most people don't want to lose their experience, comfortable skills, and all the other stuff that they've grown, right?
Yeah.
So what is your take on, those kind of aspects, at least in Asia, I would say?
Yeah, we have a long way to go. And you're going to hear from my co-host on what he did in the previous company that I worked for in bringing women back to the workplace.
Okay.
And I think that a lot more of that needs to be done because there is still the stigma of if you took a career break for whatever reason, somehow all of that experience and your previous experience is no longer relevant. And I think in order for us to have true representation in the workplace that is representing the population in Asia, and gender-wise, women are anywhere between 48% to 51%, depending on the country in Asia. We are still far behind from that. But I've seen so many people do, I've transitioned so many times. I did 8 roles in 8 years at EMC. And I did all kinds because I chose to be a generalist. I didn't want to be a specialist. I've seen CMOs become head of sales carrying a P&L, right? So I think anything is possible, and it starts with what do you want? Mm-hmm. And I think that figuring out what you want, what are your non-negotiables, what kind of environment do you thrive in, who do you want to work for, person, and where are your skills and gifts. I think at some point, I had a person on my leadership team a few weeks ago said, I feel really bad because I can do my job in 3 days. And my peers are taking, 6 days. And I was like, yeah, but you had 30 years to get to that stage. So yes, and she felt bad because she was earning the same amount of salary. I'm like, yeah, but you had 30 years. That's why you can do it in 3 days.
Yeah.
So you shouldn't feel bad about that. There's so much of transferable skills that isn't spoken about enough that I think you can transition into anything. I think character, integrity, and intelligence actually trumps everything else.
I agree. I that's exactly what I do when I even recruit someone, right? It's not really everything that they've put on the CV. It's more about how they think, what they like, what they think is important values, and all of that. Because for me, the work, as much as, yes, we all come out from university with this armed with all these degrees and everything else, I think the real world is more about what you can apply and how you apply it to people when you work with them. Because no matter what you do, at the end of the day, you realize that you'll be able to do your work. What happens is how you do your work with all the people that you have to work with. And that's always the big challenge. And that's what most people struggle with. And then they're like, oh, I don't like this environment. I quit. I'm leaving. And then they go on to greener pastures and they realize, oh, well, this is not working out very well here too. So I think that's definitely true, Ma. And I've been fortunate, I would say, to work with an environment or a company that does encourage women to take on, different roles and try different things. It's like put up your hand and say, okay, this is what you would like to do. But in all fairness, I guess you should be able to commit to what you want to do as well, because that's just who you are. But then you realize, as much as management is willing to give you this opportunity to do it, you have an entire cohort of colleagues that are like, sure, you're going to move from that to that. Like, why? Aren't you just happy doing what you're doing? Why do you have to do something else? And so there's all these questions, and you ask yourself, okay, so is this going to be a problem now because they seem to think I can't do what I want to really do? But I guess it's always a trial and error process. And the question is how much the management or leadership team invests in the fact that they know you're going to be able to pull this off. And I think I would be able to do a lot of that, but I would also like to be able to harness or garner that support and show the younger generation, right? It can be done, right? You can do this because you've just got that right behaviors and the right mindset. And it can be done. It's not something that you have to sit back and say, oh, I have to be stuck in this little box and just think about this box because this is just where I belong.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that rounds off our conversation nicely. Yeah. So I'm excited to hear what my co-host has to say. So Mohan, it was great to talk to you today.
It was great being
all
here.
big questions. We could continue this conversation, but I loved all of them. And I love that you are asking these questions because you're not alone. And we're all going to learn together, hopefully, from the show.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. I'm so pleased to welcome Duncan Hewett. He is the author and champion for women representation in business and technology. He's focused on driving actionable results for gender diversity in the workplace and has consistently driven acceleration for women across leadership levels. I am evidence of his actionable results. Duncan is a tech industry veteran, having led billion-dollar businesses across Asia. I first met Duncan in 2018 when I was invited to speak at a VMware event. Duncan, at the time, was CEO of VMware in Asia Pacific. He came up to me during the briefing meeting prior to the event and told me the story of how he took the job and asked for the org chart, and there was only one woman on his senior leadership team. When I joined to work for Duncan in March 2019, I was the 8th woman. You know you've worked for someone who has greatly impacted your life when you choke up tears to record his farewell message, which is exactly what happened to me. He wrote the book, Accelerating Women, a book I recommend every manager in the world to read. And that was published in 2021 and showcases real stories of his exemplary leadership in support of inclusion and representation by harnessing the power of self, leaders, organizations. He currently mentors a number of female entrepreneurs as well as acts as advisor to a number of ventures who support women in business. Duncan, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Delighted to be here, Uma, and thank you for a lovely introduction. Now you made me tear up. So.
Yes, and that's one of the things we used to talk about in the aspect of showing emotions in the workplace. And I would have to say, and I told this story, and it's publicized in a magazine now, on how I cried in front of you. And I think that is a great story on what relates back to what Mohana just shared about this pressure that women tend to put on ourselves. And specifically in that story, I put a lot of pressure on myself and found myself in that situation where 9 months into the role, I just burst out in tears in front of you. And you, from your perspective, thought you were putting that pressure on me by advocating for me, championing me, and telling everybody globally about how I was going to create this change in the business.
Yeah, it was an interesting experience because I felt really bad. I walked past you at 7:30 in the morning. We were the only two in the office at the time, and I asked you, how you were, and you said you were fine, which is always a warning sign because fine is never fine. And at that point, I think I looked back and then saw tears rolling down your face. And so we went off and found a private room, and you sobbed your heart out for a while. And there was a couple of things. One, I didn't realise I'd put you under so much pressure. I was delighted around the progress we were making. It was a long-term strategic change. But I think there were a couple of things through that experience. I mean, one of them was, genuinely, emotions are actually really important as part of the workplace. There are too many managers and leaders that believe there's no place for it. Yet it's what we function as people. It's how we interact. It's how we learn. And so emotions are actually important to accept as part of the workplace. And we're all vulnerable at different times. And if you can create a trusted space to have the right discussions, it doesn't mean out in the middle of the floor. There's so much more value you can get out of the interactions in the workplace. And, I think I told you at the time, you weren't the only one in my leadership team that cried at different times through the career due to pressure, due to things happening outside of work. Because actually there are a lot of things in our life that, we're always trying to manage.
Yeah. And I think that cemented for me what is important to me in terms of the person I worked for, the environment I was in, etc. So yeah, I was more than willing to do the work. And one of the things Mohana brought up in our chat is, as women think about transitions, I have seen, in the 3+ years I worked for you, navigate all these maneuvering on bringing different kinds of talent into the organization, getting them to do different roles, right? I mean, your VP of strategy and operations came from learning, for example. So I think you are a great example, having run billion-dollar businesses in Asia, that yes, it is very possible. So maybe you can tell from your perspective why you chose to do that. And if you had one advice for women who are thinking about doing something different in their career, and if they were given the trust to do it, but they have doubts, what would they do?
So I think there's a couple of things. I mean, first of all, as a leader in an organisation, is realising the largest single untapped talent pool is women. So having an organisation, and there's tons of research that has a diverse portfolio of people from different backgrounds, ethnic as well as women and men and, all the other varieties, actually is what brings power to your organisation. And you have to commit to it and work to it. It doesn't happen overnight. As you said, my first day, I asked for a picture of the org chart, and it happened to be a PowerPoint chart with faces on it. And Pam was the only woman on the leadership team. And so you just didn't have a diverse environment, and so you just don't get the right inputs to make a successful business. And I genuinely believed it's what creates sustained success in organisations. Now, you can't just hire. You've actually got to create a supportive environment to make it work. But I think there's a couple of things, and I guess it just triggered around, certainly career transitions. They're not easy. But there's a couple of things that are worth knowing about. One is you can't change the past. So your career journey you've been on is past. It's just the journey you've been on. So you need to think about, where am I today? What do I like and what do I dislike about what I do today? What skills do I have that are transferable? What are things, and I think, Uma, you framed it well, there are characteristics that come with every role, and some are non-negotiable. If you happen to have kids that are locked in a school that you really like and it's doing the right thing from the kids, then location becomes important. So you need a role that actually is going to support that. That needs to be part of the characteristics you consider. That includes what title, and how much money I've got to earn, because I've got to be able to support a family. So bringing those things together around what you do today, and then say, well, what are 4 options I would consider going forward? I like your example around, if I had 6 months, is this where I want to invest my time? But think around, what are the 4 examples? And then you can be more deliberate around, okay, so what relationships do I have to go and explore those 4 options as my next transition? There's a couple of other things that's worth knowing. Internal transitions, people will take more risk on you having the right skills or exactly the right background, and typically will go down as low as a 50% fit. Externally, much more conservative. So people are going to look for an 80% fit to the role that they're trying to fill. As you described, having a growth or learning mindset is one of the things that makes a huge difference. Because if someone has that, then you can see the potential and you look at their experience and say, well, I'm going to provide the next experience on their journey, and then you've got to nurture it. One of the things I used to do as a leader to nurture is actually offer my new leaders into my leadership team 100 hours of my time in the first 6 months. And the most valuable thing you can give is your time to help them succeed. And, you know, I'm invested in them succeeding. It makes a difference for my organisation. So I think that piece around your career is a journey. Your past you can't change. You're here now. Now what do I do next? What are the options? And then being deliberate around, so what are the relationships I need for those options? And why am I the best candidate?
So if I'm a woman listening to this and I'm thinking about transitioning, I'm thinking about a new role, and I want to start building out this narrative on, you know, here's what I'm great at, here's what I do best. You know, when I started interviewing for VMware, what I did was I went back to all my direct reports previously, and I asked them this question. If I wasn't in the room and somebody asked you about me, what would you say? And so I collected that. You know, then I went back to ex-bosses, I went to mentors, so that I could see it. For me, it was like I could see it in writing. You know, it was almost like this self-validation exercise that helped me. Like, do you have other tips? Because you work with a lot of women. Like, how could they help themselves build that narrative?
So I think there's a couple things. The narrative applies to the job you're applying to. So you make your narrative around what's the right combination of strengths will differ depending on which role you're going after, which is why it's sometimes good to have 3 or 4 options. The thing I found consistently over particularly the last 20 years of trying to support women is confidence is the number one challenge. And not recognising actually the talent and the experience they have. And, well, if I just spent a bit longer in this role, I'd be, better at it, or I'd know more. And then I'll think about it when someone asks me in 6 months' time. And that's why having people you can have a genuine discussion with and you can test it out with is really important. Because when you sort of step back and sort of reflect on, well, these are all the things I've done, it's pretty amazing. But recognise that confidence issue actually is both your strength and your weakness. It's your strength because that inner voice that forces you to keep learning and have that growth mindset is absolutely your superpower. It enables you to change, it enables you to take on new things. It's absolutely your sort of superpower. But that inner voice is also the piece around, well, am I good enough? Is also the confidence thing. And that you've got to keep it balanced. So having people around you that are supportive is critical. Having an honest assessment around this is what I've done and this is what I could do next. Knowing that if it's an external role, you need an 80% fit in most cases. Occasionally you get people who take a risk and will come down lower to a 50% fit. And occasionally people like yourself take a big leap. But most of us actually don't do big leaps. We actually, career is a journey. So there is a connection.
Yeah. So moving from career to life, just to round up the conversations here around what Mohana brought up on, that time in life where you ask yourself a lot of questions. You made a huge transition, leaving the corporate world. So
I did.
And I think, I can't remember the numbers you gave me about the amount of travel you did over 30 plus years, but it was significant. And it obviously had impact on your family, on your health. I'm sure you loved all the things that you did. And then to leave all of that and, leave Singapore, go back to Sydney, actually away from Sydney. If there's one thing or a couple of things that you would share on your learnings, your biggest learnings in making that transition, what would that be?
Yeah, unfortunately, I was away from home. We worked out for 4,500 days over the 20 years,
Wow.
which is more than 50% of the time. So I wasn't in the country as three kids were growing up, and my wife did an amazing job bringing them up, and they've all turned into fantastic adults. But I think that piece around it does certainly senior leadership roles where you're on the road a lot do have impacts on your health, on your mental well-being. And I'd spent 8.5 years leading Asia Pacific across 2 companies, and it was time. And much as my boss at the time didn't believe me when I said I'm leaving in 6 months' time, and I'm giving you warning, I'm not going to anywhere else. I'm going to go and do something different. He spent the first 4 months trying to talk me out of it because I was younger than him. It was the right time for me. And I've gone and done some other things that I genuinely I enjoy. Mentoring women who are entrepreneurs who are struggling to sort of get that next level through their company, and they need someone to talk to. Confidence being part of it, Uma.
Yeah.
And I love that part of what I do. And as you said, just come back from doing some travelling, which has been fantastic as well. I think the transitions, it's being honest with yourself. Medical events absolutely help in terms of managing transition, because that's sort of enforced on you. Something happens, they're going, okay, so maybe the body's telling me something. And unfortunately, when the numbers are 5 in front, there's more of those things seems to happen. It just, life catches up with you. But I think that the important part is actually to look at, when you get up in the morning, is this what I enjoy doing? And because I like the way you framed it around, if it's fun for me, then it just doesn't feel like work. It's actually what makes you tick. And for me, running large organisations and growing a business was what made me tick. It kept me occupied 24 hours a day. Even when sleeping, you'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking about things and, I've got the solution for that. And then have to get up and write it down so you didn't forget it for the next morning. But I loved it. I just, loved doing it, and it was fun. And I think that's the thing about life and career as a journey. Anytime you can find a way of matching what you like doing is, what someone's going to pay you to do, is always going to be the best option. And it's never perfect. But if you can land yourself somewhere where it's fun and someone's paying you, then you're in the right spot. And keep doing it. I mean, I ended up leading VMware for Asia for 5.5 years. I don't think that's what I originally set out to do, but I loved it. I loved the organisation. I loved the freedom it gave me to be creative and change things.
Yeah. And I got front row seat to watch you experiment a lot. As an ex-IBMer, I was like, we're going to do what now? And, we can do that too. So yes, you certainly had, if I could visualize you, you were like the octopus, and you were just moving things around. And at any one point, you were always trying new things to figure out if that was going to get us somewhere.
Yeah, and I mean, out of that discussion, a number of months later, came Tara, which helped women return to work. And we kicked off that program. I went back and briefed Pat because I was going to spend VMware's money, and he never even asked me how much I was going to spend. And we sponsored a program to provide free education to enable women who'd left the workforce in India to get them back into the workforce. And what happens between years 3 and 8, you actually lose 50% of the women. They leave and they don't come back. And so we started down this process around, well, we're going to help them return. We're going to give them free education, a free network, engagement, mentoring. We worked out over time it wasn't about the education. It was actually about confidence. It was enabling them to see role models of others who made it back into the workforce and what did they do. You know, today there's over 30,000 women in the TARA program and over 6,000 back in over 1,000 companies. We made a difference to their lives. And then, you know, if you ever get a chance, you read the stories. I can't make it past the third one. You just need a box of tissues. You just completely changed these women's lives. It started as an idea, and we just went and funded it and briefed Modi and went on a journey and learnt as we went.
Yeah, that was an amazing program. Well, thank you, Duncan. It was great to have you and have this conversation. And I'm sure Moana took a lot out of our dialogue today.
Thank you very much for having me.
If you're hearing this message, you've listened to a new episode all the way to the end. And for that, I thank you for the generosity of your time. To wrap up, here are a few points from this episode. Today, we talked about transitioning, especially in the workplace, but also in a much bigger context of life. You've heard from my guest today, Mohana, and my co-host, Duncan, about what it means to take risks when you're thinking about transitions, the questions you should ask yourself, and just being able to trust yourself to make those moves. And I love what Duncan just said about being honest with yourself. It's certainly something that I had to grapple with in terms of what's truly important to me and what is it that I versus everybody else want. So I'm curious to know, what else did you take away from this conversation? I'd love to hear what you think, so please follow, like, and leave a comment. I promise to read all of them. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with your friends. And if you'd like to be a guest on the show, check out the link below to send in your details. See you soon.